making an image is my greatest joy. It never changes, and it's something I must do. And I feel a rush, a kind of calm, upward rush when I make images. When I get on a film, at first it's kind of hard to tell what visual images are going to go together. But after it's underway, it's sort of automatic. This works, that doesn't work. My mind can kind of relax when I work on the animation film, but my mind is really on the long autobiography film, and thinking about how I'm ever going to show it. And I've done an awful lot of scissor work in my lifetime, and when I get into cutting, it's kind of a fascination that I enjoy. These things then come off the page, and they can kind of start to take on a life of their own when they go into the animated film. I think I was a filmmaker from the get-go. I can remember always wanting a movie projector. There were even coupons in comic books that if you did something, you could send it in with some money and get a projector. I never could manage that, so I made, out of comic strips, scrolls that would go by an aperture in a shoebox. I was maybe 6 years old. And then later, my father, who taught in the high school, one year was in charge of audio-visual, and he brought home a Bell & Howell projector, just like the one here in the studio, and he had the movies that they showed in the lunchroom at noontime, and there was Buster Keaton. And so Buster Keaton would grab a fire hose off the wall and run down the hallway with the fire hose, and I would hit the reverse button on the projector, and Buster Keaton would go backwards, and then I'd hit the forward switch, and I'd have him going back and forth. So I was experimental filmmaker right from the beginning. The kind of films that I make, everyone has always had difficulty in giving a title word to. First it was called underground films, a reversion to avant-garde films, then American independent cinema, and there are about 6 or 7 titles to try to describe simply people who work with film the same as a painter works with paint and canvas, period. The first film I made was with nephews of my girlfriend. The next one probably was the One Romantic Venture of Edward with Stan Brakhage. Stan was 1 year ahead of me in high school. We had a group of intellectual rebels. We called ourselves the Gadflies, and Stan was kind of, I'd call him the leader of the gang. And then after I left college, we were still going. We did one-act plays in the mountain town in Colorado, and then some of us came out to San Francisco because we heard that's where the poets and the painters were. I started to work with Michael McClure on a whole series of films, and the best known one is Visions of a City. I had seen one black and white photograph of a Cornell piece in a magazine before I went to New York. One summer, Stan Brakhage and I, we were both staying in Maya Deren's apartment. And one day there was a knock on the door, and there was a man, when I opened the door, that looked like a walking mummy. He was so emaciated looking, but very interesting, and with him was a lovely young woman. They came in, and completely unannounced, and I remember Cornell sitting in a chair, and I don't think we had enough chairs for the rest of us, but the three of us kind of sat around like students at the feet of the master, and Cornell talked for about 2 hours. I have no memory whatsoever of anything that he said, but we were just enchanted. So then began a 10-year-long correspondence.
This film came into being because Joseph really did want something of himself and his work recorded. He always turned down offers to write or speak about what he was trying to do with the boxes. But on the other hand, he was continually looking for people who could translate his intentions. That's one reason I took the camera to Flushing that summer in 1965. I just roamed around the house with 1 or 2 lights, filming. I wanted to record something of this man who was my teacher and friend, and incidentally one of America's greatest 20th century artists. At the time I was living there and working as his assistant on boxes and films. Someone described his work as crystal cages, and sometimes they really looked like that. He was pretty specific with me one day. He said that his working concern was only to bring certain threads of reminiscence together. The same was true of his collages. He called it high collage. Here's one he sent to my daughter. I hope this humble style of film would have pleased Joseph, because his influence on me touches the very foundation of my life.
I had been living with my high school girlfriend in San Francisco. I went to New York. She did not go to New York. And then I got the word that we were no longer a couple. I came back to where my parents lived in Denver, and I was very despondent. So I sailed in the Merchant Marine for 3 years, all off the West Coast to either the Orient or Hawaii. I started to have a good relationship with the captain. I felt it was okay to bring the camera out, and I asked him, can I go around the ship and make some film? And he said, you can go anywhere you want, just don't hang by your toes from the rigging. I mean, kind of a cliche thing to say, but that's what he said. And so I don't know if the other sailors had heard that the captain said it was okay for me to do that, but it was perfect. They never looked at the camera, they never paid any attention to me, they never asked me about what I was doing or anything. I came back to San Francisco and
man is in pain. Ten bright balls bounce into the unseen, unknown doubles net. Man is a false window. Through which his double walks to the truth. That falls as 10 bright balls. The malefic hand tossed into the air.
I was a beatnik. I was before hippie. And that was a little different. That was not flower children stuff. That was more like trying to carve a serious alternative lifestyle to what was going on in the Eisenhower years, which was either total boredom, nothing happening, or Joseph McCarthy and the House On-American Activities stuff, which influenced all of us very much. That was the start of the 60s revolution. Everyone was opening up to sight and sound. I was very lucky, and Pauline Kael was running Berkeley Cinema Guild in Berkeley. I had no money, so she'd let me come in free. And I saw all those European classic films. I was able to immerse myself, just one after another. It was quite extraordinary. And then I began to see more of that first wave of European avant-garde. That was a different kind of eye-opener. I thought, oh, this is a whole different thing that you can do with film. They don't have to be stories. I started playing around with graphics. and making a lot of experiments. A lot of them didn't come to anything, but the first complete animated film was Duo Concertante. I used to take films that had no soundtracks to a cafe in San Francisco and show them in the back room and improvise with the radio. At that time, there was good stuff on the radio, and on came this Viotti violin sonata that went from beginning to end exactly with the film. In a serendipitous way. So the progression was actually quite slow in terms of technical advances. Until people started to respond to it, I really didn't know what I had, because I sent it to Ann Arbor and it won a first prize at Ann Arbor Film Festival. The way I started making cutout animation was by looking at the collages of Max Ernst, the two collage novels in black and white. And at that time, you could not buy those two collage novels, but Jess, the painter, had copies of them. He lent them to me, and I photographed every page, every one of them. So I would see this coming up in the solution, the photographic solution, one after another, and it was like watching a long movie in slow motion. And one day I woke up from a nap and I said, I could make those move. I could make those cutouts move. It was the start of it. In the early 60s, I would give speeches at the beginning of all my film showings about the death and destruction and the spiral into evil that was happening in Vietnam. And people in the audience didn't know what I was talking about. Americans did not know we were in Vietnam, dying. They'd look at me with, what is he talking about? People started to know what was going on in Vietnam. A group in New York sent out a call to all filmmakers to make an anti-war film, and I made a little 3-minute film called Johnny.
Just because he's gonna die, he's gonna be a hero from now till the end of time. So shed no tears for Johnny boy, marching in the thin red line.
I was seeing these anti-war films and they had explosions and dead bodies and blood all over the place, and I thought, gee, I don't want to add more of that imagery to the world.
Reason why he knows he's gotta go, fight for power and glory, Johnny go to war. And if 100 boys should die, we can send in 100 more. No tears for
Johnny, I took with a lot of other films when they had me come to Ann Arbor. The war was really nasty. After the main show was over, they just kept showing over and over and over again.
gonna be a hero from now till the end of time. So shed no tears for Johnny boy, marching in the thin red line.
A close friend had a little boy about 5 years old, and I put him in a swing, and he was just the picture of innocence swinging. And then on the soundtrack, you hear Chad and Jeremy singing, marching in the thin red line, if 100 boys should die, we can send in 100 more. That's the only political film I did. I'd been making films for about 12 years at this point. I had a family. I had to make a living. I had a student in one of my classes at the University of California Extension one summer. She was interested in filmmaking, and I was just getting interested in Buddhism. And she told me that her husband was a Tibetan Lama. Her name was Nazli Pima, and she said her husband was Tartun Tulku, and he had a center for Buddhist studies in Berkeley. She invited me to come over and meet him. I said I'd like to, so I got to know the two of them privately before then going to the center to listen to Tartun Tulku teach and conduct puja ceremonies. I got very involved. I filmed a puja ceremony, and then the center had a show of tankas and rupas at California College of Arts and Crafts Gallery. When I got serious about doing good shots for the film, I started really looking at the tankas. And those deities came through very strongly, as Tartun Tulku said they would. He said they would be imprinted on the soul, and that they would remain with you whether you forgot them seemingly or not. And it had been made very clear to me that the deities do not exist outside the mind, that the mind is all, but that's extremely powerful. So I became very impressed with the Tibetan approach to Buddhism, and in my mind, the Tibetans seemed like spiritual athletes. Tartun Tulku opened everything for me. I still practice Buddhist meditation in the morning. It's part of my life. It's very important during the making of a film to go back to the instant that I decided to make the film, because that's where all the energy is. I had a new camera and I could see through the lens for the first time, and I could do more, experimenting with new camera techniques. And part of it was trying to plumb what death is. Actually, I had done Our Lady of the Sphere before, Sacred Art of Tibet, and Our Lady of the Sphere is based on my reading of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. When one thinks about death, where do you go? In the film, you see the little circus boy fall, hit the ground, and fall to death. And then his spirit go down below to the underworld, to the bardo. That's what I was playing around with in the film. I had a very, very strong, very deep sense of working with death and how in our world today we cover up death. So if somebody in the circus, for instance, they would strike up the band and cover up the tragedy. The main premise of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is that the departed soul will be seduced by bright colors. I did not try to film the Tibetan Book of the Dead in any sense. It was just lying there in the back of my mind constantly as I made the film. But it's always been a practice with me not to try to put meanings on either the incidents or the characters or the objects in my animation films, because then I get very self-conscious. So it was informing without being literal. So, can you see some of this here? When he's out, then we're going to pan over this way and get the second photographer, like that, something like that. And now we're set for anything to happen. We got a setup here where anything is possible to take place. And that's why I work with this kind of animation. One thing leads to another, and a surreal sequence takes place. But I don't know, among all this material, all these figures laid out, often I'll go with whatever, when this guy is out, I'll probably go with whatever I see next. This way, the continuity may not be as good as if I planned it all out, but there's a certain spontaneity to the whole thing. So anyway, turn on the motor. Petaluma is where I live and where this studio is. It's about 1 hour's drive north of San Francisco. And The reason I'm talking about San Francisco is that that's where I was making a living. Okay, here we go. This is the opening title for Cosmic Alchemy, the film that I was working on the animation stand. Transformation is the name of the game. At the Art Institute in San Francisco, they kept letting us expand. And there was energy created. The energy, it just kept drawing out of me more projects. And so working on a theater and teaching at the San Francisco Art Institute was all part of trying to carve out and sustain and build this whole different way of cinema as a way of describing the soul. That's what we were doing, indulging in things that were not in the mainstream. And those of us that were my age, that were in San Francisco and New York, started to carve out what is now a whole institution of American avant-garde film. Cinema is a natural tool for exploring the unconscious, and it's hardly ever used. It's a kind of slow motion dreaming to do this kind of work. Sophie's Place is a long cutout animation film, and the idea was that for some reason I wanted to make a so-called feature. Every once in a while I get that itch to make, instead of short films, to make a feature-length film. I searched through my books of cutouts, characters, and objects, and animated those onto the scene. I thought it would take 10 years to do. Come into the studio every morning and work and see what happened. After about 5 years of animating, the film was done. It was just under 90 minutes. Animators are just very drawn to transformation. It seems natural to the animated world for things to lose one shape and take on another shape, as they probably do in dreams, I suppose. I had a first edition of Festive Doré illustrations to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I thought it would be rather surreal for something visual. But the more I worked with it, the poem took hold of me. I had to do the whole poem, and it hit me immediately that Orson Welles was the voice of the old mariner. I'm inside the bank filling out a slip at a table with the window beyond me, and I'm looking through the window, and some guy out on the sidewalk in the little embouchure of the window outside has this big book that he's opening up and showing another guy. And he's opening this book up, and I'm seeing this upside down through a window in the bank. And I'm seeing these big, huge, beautiful engravings through the window. And I just tore up the bank slip and ran for the door. And I came up behind him, I tapped him on the shoulder, and I said, "Do you want to sell that book?" And he turned around and he said, "How'd you know I wanted to find somebody to sell this book to?" I said, "I'll give you $40. And I had about $135 in the bank. And I ran back to the bank and I got $40 and bought the book. You tell me, is that just accidental? Is there something mystical going on? But I seem to have gotten into a place where that's how I work.
And through the drifts, the snowy cliffs, descend a dismal sheen. Nor shapes of men nor beasts we ken. The ice was all between. The ice was here. The ice was there, the ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled like noises in a swound. At length did cross an albatross. Through the fog it came.
I guess it's kind of crazy, but I accept the process on the idea that I can only do what I do. I can't be like another artist. I can't be a feature narrative filmmaker. I can't work in Hollywood. I can't make independent dramatic features, although I've made a couple. But really, this is what I can do best. The long 12-hour film was called Circus Savage. And I have everything I think that the filmmaker ever has to contend with. Where can you get a showing? Can you finance the showings of the film? Will anybody be interested in seeing it? Is it worth doing? All of those questions. What's frustrating about it is how do you possibly show a very personal 12-hour film? Where do you go? What do you do next? What's the process? What techniques to use? What's the time frame? How much money is it going to cost? What equipment do I need? All of those questions. Hi, Amy. Lawrence. I was hoping you'd have your cell phone on, but I think I will have at the end all the different corners of the world that I poked into with my camera. I kind of have a feeling that it'll lead somewhere, but where, I'm not quite sure. Since I retired from teaching, I've made 8 films. I'm 74, but I have limited energy. Nevertheless, I will make films until I breathe my last breath. I started thinking back to my very first memory because that involves my other passion, which is gardening. My first memory is of lying in very, very green grass, looking into a bed of very bright yellow marigolds. The garden is what I call the big sculpture. It's always changing. There are surprises. Things are planned. They never come out exactly the way they're envisioned, but often better. Yeah, it's the big sculpture. Impermanence. It's very strong in my life right now. Okay, we're impermanent, and in one sense, life moves very quickly. We're in and out of it. On the other hand, as Cocteau says, life is very long. How many nights have you read each night in bed? Over and over and over again. The past is time. The future is time. The moment is timeless. Every moment is like every other moment, timeless.